guide to selectors. Selectors are useful both in CSS and in JavaScript. And the basic concept of a selector is that you're going to reach into the HTML and do something with it. So the simplest selector would be the name of an element. We usually aren't going to use this because usually it's not specific enough for a complex program. But I could, for example, in CSS, select a button, and CSS has a selector and then a set of rules. Each rule is a property and a value. So to test the selector, I always take a property I know how to use, color, and I just apply it. So I'm going to change the color of the button to red, and that works right away. Similarly, I've got a couple of span elements in my game. I could choose a span selector and make those items, let's say, purple. So in CSS, note there's no quotes. We just write the selector right there, just like that. Now, let's say that I had more than one button in my game. I might have a reset button. Like that. And maybe I don't want both buttons to be the same. Then I'm going to want to do something else. I could add an ID or a class. So if I add an ID here, this can be any word. It's like a variable, info button. The way you select an ID is with a hashtag. So hashtag info button, color, make it IX blue. Now the info button is blue. All buttons are red except for info buttons, which are blue. Notice that multiple rules can affect you in CSS. So for example, if I made the buttons have bold font, both are bold, but the color comes from the more specific rule. All right, in JavaScript, if I wanted this show info button to do something, for example, it could say query selector. Query selector now takes in quotes the same selector. So let's say that I wanted to grab the info button. I could say query selector info button, and that's going to grab the info button that's there. I could, for example, remove it from the game with the remove call. That's probably not what you want to do. Usually what we're going to do with those selectors is probably, grab the class list and use its toggle method, which will allow us to turn on or off a class. So for example, we could say toggle active, and then in our CSS, we could add a rule. Now class selectors start with a dot, that's a new one, and they can be connected. So I can say when the info button is active, or I could just say when anything is active, make its color dark gray. Now unfortunately, that rule doesn't apply because the info button rule is considered more specific. So now I have to be more specific and say if info buttons are active, this now has two selectors. It's more specific than this one. And now it goes from gray to blue when I turn it on and off. It's a little hard to see. I'll make the background color red. Now you can see right away. Ooh, that's hideous. All right. Notice I don't do nice styles when I'm testing. I just use simple, easy to understand rules. So to review, my HTML has an ID. I use that ID in my CSS to reach in and set styling rules. I can also use that ID in my JavaScript to grab the element, and then I can use a class list to toggle it. I could also do other things with the element if I wanted to. So that's pretty handy. You also might have classes inside of your HTML. So for example, I have these spans around my cool game. Maybe I have a special brand font I want to use or brand color. I'll call those class equals brand. And then in my HTML, I can add a brand rule that says the color should be this kind of magenta-y color. The font weight should be bold, and the font family should be Futura. There we go. Now every time my cool game shows up in that span, it's got the special rule. One warning if I were to, for example, say query selector brand, oops, got to put that in quotes, and class list remove brand, that'll just remove the brand. It'll only remove the first one the first time and the second one the second time. So why is that? Query selector gives you back the first element, not all of the elements. So query selector is really handy if you just want to grab one thing and change it. If you wanted to do a bunch of things, it's harder. There's a method called query selector all, which will give you a list. And then you could call for each, which will call a function for each item. And then I could say something like element l.classList.remove brand. That is significantly harder. So now that is successfully going to remove, or I could say, well, that's going to remove the brand from all of them. That's not really useful. I was just showing how you could do that. So query selector all, you have to learn how to work with lists, which we haven't really covered yet. So for our purposes, we're going to stick to just query selector, which will always just give you the first one of something. We could make this show info button. If we want to make this info class here, this is some info about my class, my game. We could add an ID for it, info. And we could use query selector to grab that. And then class list toggle active. Now I could make a rule for info, make it invisible, display none. And I could make a rule for info active, display block. Now it shows up when I click. We're going to do that a lot fancier in other tutorials, but this shows you how selectors work. So the gist is, over here I have an ID. I can use that in my CSS, or I can use it in my JavaScript with query selector. Query selector gives me an object, which is quite useful. If you're curious about that object, you could play with it right here. Well, actually, you're better off playing with it in the real console. And you can get a feel for, in general, JavaScript's pretty fun to play with in the console. So if you go to debug mode, inspect, you could actually do this on any website, not just your own. We'll go to the console, and I could say document query selector info const l equals, and now I have an L object. And in the inspector, you can actually see that L object is this info element. If I type a dot, I can see what's sort of available from that dot. Blur, click, draggable. I can get its width and height, which is quite useful. You can set various different callbacks on it, and so on and so forth. So for example, I could make this L on click equals function console log hello. And now anytime I click, it's going to run that function. So that's pretty cool. Also, there is the L style object, which has what are called the inline styles. And probably more useful for our purposes, there's this L class list, which will show any classes that are on. And we can either toggle or add and remove classes when we like. So if I want to toggle the active class, that's going to make it disappear. Okay,